Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a few seconds to make sure everyone gets into the meeting all right, and then we'll begin. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. And my special thanks, especially to Neil at the Center of Islamic Studies for all his help in organizing this event today. And of course, to the Cambridge Festival for hosting us as well. So the Cambridge Festival, for those of you who don't know, is an amalgamation of the previous Cambridge Festival of Ideas and the Cambridge Festival of Science, which is running together as one virtual event this year. For the first time. And it's an interdisciplinary event meant to kind of highlight some of the innovative research coming out of the university and the Cambridge community more broadly. And again, thanks very much to them for hosting this event. My name is Toshif Kara, and I'm a research associate at the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and I'll be facilitating and participating in this afternoon's discussion on minority questions. Now, the current pandemic, in addition to sort of exposing existing inequalities and highlighting some of the limits of modern politics, has also demonstrated just how prevalent and indispensable statistical thinking is for the state. Just imagine how difficult it would be to reflect upon the past year without recalling the constant sort of numerical updates and various curves and waves of the pandemic. And what is fascinating about the current moment is how it has actually introduced this language of demography and measurement, language usually reserved for a particular kind of technocratic policymaker, for instance, into the sphere of public debate. But as we know, as historians here at Cambridge and elsewhere continue to demonstrate, many of these forms of governance and knowledge making, surveillance and methods of statistical gathering, for example, were either invented in or perfected during the colonial period in places like India, for instance, and were often disproportionately applied to Muslims who, despite Islam's global reach, were usually identified as minorities in various parts of the empire. So this session will try to sort of briefly flip the vantage point, as it were, and bring together some researchers from different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss how Muslims themselves either problematized or address the question of the minority in different contexts in the past and today. So joining us today are two of my very sort of distinguished colleagues, and I'm really happy to have them both join us. First, we have Dr. Emanuele degli Esposti, who is a research associate at the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. She obtained her PhD in political science from SOAS at the University of London, and her current research examines the public forms of activism undertaken by Twelver Shia Muslims in Europe, especially those that might be said to be geared towards the cultivation of a European Shiism. She's also an established journalist and founder of the Arab Review, and her writing has appeared in the New Statesman and the White Review. So a very warm welcome to Emanuele. Also with us today is Dr. Amr Sohail, who is an early career research fellow in politics and international studies at Corpus Christi College here at the University of Cambridge. He received his DPhil in history at the University of Oxford, and he is currently revising it into a book tentatively titled The Muslim Secular, which we might hear a little bit about today. As an intellectual historian of modern India and Pakistan, Amr is interested in those ideas that continue to shape contemporary politics in both countries. He's also a filmmaker, and in 2016, he made an hour-long documentary film titled Azad and Jinnah, a political rivalry in late colonial India, which dramatizes and contextualizes a crucial moment in world history. And having seen some clips from the film myself, I recommend it to all of you interested in learning more about that period. So just before we begin, I'll just sort of sketch out the way that this event will go. We'll begin with a few short presentations from the three of us. I'll go first, followed by Emanuele, and then Amr. We'll have a brief discussion between the three of us after those presentations, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you. If you do have some questions that come up during the presentations, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we ask that you sort of remain muted and wait until the end of the presentations to raise your hand and ask some questions. I'll begin with my sort of brief presentation right now. So I work on the Kwaja community, and this is kind of a sort of exemplary minority community in the history of the sort of 19th and 20th century. They're a trading community originally from Western India, but who by the 19th century had a very sort of established presence around the Indian Ocean world, especially in East Africa. But despite, or perhaps even because of this sort of dispersed presence, they're usually defined as a kind of minority, no matter what the vantage point is. So they are sort of Muslim subjects in the context of India, Indian subjects in the context of Africa, and Shia subjects in the world of Islam. And so they're constantly sort of pigeonholed as a permanent minority who sort of belong nowhere. But I want to talk a little bit today about how this minority status is actually not so fixed, and certainly not something that is very easy to pin down, especially for the Khojas, partly because their philosophical and intellectual tradition is one that sees external forms of identification and appearances in general as sort of secondary to a concealed or veiled truth. So rather than being a kind of exemplary minority or kind of typical minority, they actually call into question, or I want to argue that they call into question the minority-majority division altogether. So one place to start might be with their intellectual tradition itself, which sort of drew heavily and simultaneously on Sunni, Shia, Hindu, and even Buddhist traditions all at the same time. This is kind of exemplified in their sort of poetic or literary tradition, an example of which we see here, which sort of calls out the rigid formations of the mullah or the judge or the pundit to speak towards a sort of greater understanding of the truth that lies beyond or in excess of some of these external forms. But in the 19th century, it was this kind of flexible and porous conception of Islam with the coming of empire that sort of frustrated the colonial state, who often read this kind of Islam and named it as sort of incoherent or confused. So one telling quote in this regard comes from a colonial judge in the 19th century, who, when confronted with the Khoja intellectual tradition, named it as totally chaotic, for instance. So this is just one thing that he said in the courtroom. To use the words of one of themselves, they call themselves Shia to a Shia, Sunnis to a Sunni, and probably neither know nor care anything of the distinctive doctrines of either of these great divisions of the Musliman world. So here we have a kind of shifting subjectivity that doesn't necessarily fit easily into the sort of classificatory forms of the colonial state. But while the colonial state sort of read this as a kind of absence of history or a kind of incoherent history, Indian political thinkers would respond to the Khojas in a very different way indeed. And Amar will sort of speak a little bit more about Indian political thought in general. But for Indian political thinkers, the sort of indeterminate nature of the Khojas was characterized not by a kind of absence of history, as it was for the colonial state, but rather by a kind of excess. So the mere fact that the Khojas sort of drew on multiple ideas and traditions in this way signaled for many of these thinkers the kind of fundamentally interchangeable character of India's many diverse communities. So the Khoja tradition enabled this community, albeit precariously at many times, to be both Hindu and Muslim, Sunni and Shia, majority and minority. So this interchangeability and the kind of constant possibility of their slippage into one or the other category sort of disrupted both the majority and the minority. And I'll sort of give a little example of what I mean here by referring to a very contemporary example, one that is relevant in the context of India today. And that is the ideas of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. So one of the sort of critical thinkers here was a man named Savarkar, who's a sort of intellectual forefather of Hindu nationalism. And the Kwajas presented a very significant conceptual problem for someone like Savarkar, precisely because of the kind of contours, the shifting subjectivity and the contours of their intellectual tradition, which rather than sort of presenting some key difference between the majority and the minority, actually gestured very much towards a similarity between those two groups. So the Kwajas sort of displayed for Savarkar this closeness. And I'll just sort of read out this quote from one of his sort of formative texts, Hindutva, who is a Hindu, published in 1923, where he reads the Kwajas in this really sort of interesting way. So he says, take the case of a patriotic Bohra or a Kwaja countryman. He loves our hand of Hindustan as his fatherland, which is indisputably the land of his forefathers. He possesses, in certain cases they do, pure Hindu blood. Especially if he is the first convert to Mohammedanism, he must be allowed to claim to inherit the blood of Hindu parents. He is an intelligent and reasonable man, loves our history and our heroes. In fact, the Kwajas as a community worship as heroes our great 10 avatars, only adding Muhammad as the 11th. He is actually, along with his community, subject to the Hindu law, the law of his forefathers. So Savarkar actually reads this community that many claim as kind of heretical or outside the fold of Islam as actually being very, very close indeed to the Hindu tradition. And so for him, kind of, the Kwaja sit at a very, very interesting point in his thought, and he's forced to kind of theorize a new Hindu subjectivity out of this very proximate community. And so I just want to kind of conclude there by sort of gesturing towards the fact that many of the communities that we see as being fixed or permanent minorities actually have a far more interesting or porous history behind them that tends to sort of disrupt these very rigid and often very sort of closed understandings of demography and population. So I'll leave it there. I don't want to take up too much time because we have some really, really interesting speakers. So we'll move on now to Manuelle to share her presentation. And I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Toshif. I think it's my turn to share my screen now. So if you could bear with me a second while I process my technological incompetence. Here we go. So today I'm going to present a little bit about my research, which is specifically looking at Twelver Shia communities in Europe. And I've titled the presentation today, A Minority Within a Minority, which is obviously a nod to the theme of the talk, but it's also a quote. It was originally ascribed to a scholar who was studying Shias, but it's used quite a lot within the Shia community itself in Europe to refer to their status as a minority within a minority in the European setting, that is, a minority sect of Islam within a greater minority of Muslims. So I'm just going to go to this slide. This is a slightly tentative slide, but just I thought in case anyone wasn't familiar with Shia Islam, what is Shiism? So obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, I work specifically on Twelver Shias, which are the majority of the minority sect of Shiism. So Shia Muslims make up between 10 and 15%, some estimates put it at 20% of Muslims globally. So they are the largest minority sect within Islam. And I'm not going to go into the theological differences, but essentially many historians put the initial split between Sunni and Shiism as beginning at the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, where there was a dispute over the succession of who should continue to lead the fold of Islam and to lead the community, and who had the rightful knowledge to be able to do that. And so this was where the initial political and theological split happened, and then the two traditions have, in many ways, are very similar. Shias follow the 5 pillars of Islam. They follow the Quran. They believe in God and in the Prophet, and in many ways follow many of the same traditions as Sunni Islam. But they have some certain specific rituals and theologies, and also hierarchical structures, specifically about scholarship and the veneration of certain scholars, which doesn't exist in the same way in Sunni Islam. And one of the most significant differences, especially when it comes to the ritual practice of Sunnism and Shiism, is the ritual commemoration of the Battle of Karbala, which was an uprising orchestrated by the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Imam Hussein, who was the son of Imam Ali, who Shias believe was the rightful successor of the Prophet. And he being Imam Hussein, organized this uprising against the leading caliph of the time, who was Yazid. And he and his family were killed, and his supporters were killed during this battle. And Shia Muslims venerate this, or commemorate this this occurrence annually during Muharram. So there are a lot of scholarship focuses on the specific rituals of mourning and commemoration that go hand in hand in this. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that, because I want to move on to the status of Shias specifically in Europe. So, as I said before, Shias in Europe are a minority within a minority. Similar to the demographics of Shias worldwide, Shias in Europe make up about 10 to 15% of the Muslim population in Europe. So that is obviously a small minority within the wider population. That does vary country to country. So, for example, in Sweden, Shia Muslims make up 40% of the Muslim population. So they are quite well represented within the Muslim population of Sweden. Having said that, there are also demographic differences when it comes to Shia Muslims versus Sunni Muslims in Europe. So while Sunni Muslims tend to predominantly come from South Asian backgrounds, Shia Muslims, while there are also quite large numbers of South Asians, especially Khojas, which I think Tawshif was just talking about, who are the South Asians from East Africa, there are also large numbers of Arabs, Iranians, and there's also a slightly socioeconomic difference, especially with the Arabs and the Iranians, where they tend to be from higher socioeconomic backgrounds than the South Asian communities. So there is a demographic difference there that from within the community itself lends this sense of, well, we're not like the rest of the Muslim population. We shouldn't be lumped together with the wider Sunni Muslim population because we are demographically different, ideologically different, ritualistically different. So there is this sense of we're not being necessarily represented by especially pejorative, wider public depictions of Islam within the European public sphere. And a part of that as well is also, as I mentioned before, this veneration of scholarship that you have in Shiism and the quintessentially transnational nature of Shiism, where scholars, especially in Iraq and Iran, have large amounts of power and privilege and patronage over Shia populations in Europe. So there are these connections between these different communities that are not necessarily reflected in a lot of the literature or a lot of the scholarship on Sunni Islam. And also, it's worth mentioning, I think I briefly said about the way in which the community, the Shia community in Europe, tend to see themselves as distinct from the Sunni population. Part of that is also a result of the European domestic context in especially the last 15, 20 years since 9/11 and the rise of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and sort of anti-Islam discourses in the media, which tend to take as Sunni Islam as their basis and their reference point. And so for Shia Muslims, they feel that they're not being represented by this. As one of my participants said to me that we don't have a voice as the Shia community. So there is this sense of the Shias within Europe trying to create a new identity for themselves, a new Muslim identity for themselves that is distinct from the wider Sunni Muslim identity. And part of this I'm going to touch on as well is, oh, hang on, no, wrong slide. I've put them in the wrong order, is the encounter between Shia Islam in Europe and European secularism. And I'm not going to go into the theory of this. I've got a lot I could say about this, but specifically the way in which the realm of the secular produces and polices the realm of religion. So here I'm taking more Assadian, Mahmoodian definition of secularism, where within the European context, the rise of a Shia-specific Muslim identity can be linked to secular politics about representation and freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and the representation of minorities, which does not necessarily exist in the countries of origin of these communities. So just to go back to the other slide, these are some of the examples of some of the campaigns and the activism that I have been documenting in my research that is taking place among Shias in Europe and also Shias globally. I should note that it's not just in Europe that this is happening. So one of the examples here, I think you can see the Shia rights in the far left-hand corner is actually from an organization called Shia Rights Watch, which was founded in 2011 in the US, but it operates globally. But what I'm seeing in the trend of these sort of common thread among these different activist networks and sort of grassroots movements is this sense of, well, we're not the same as the Sunni population. We need a Shia specific identity. We need to be represented as a minority within this context. We need to be seen for who we are rather than lumped in with the wider Muslim population. So some of these, I'm not going to go into all of these different campaigns, but I think you can see in the middle there's one which is actually from the 2014 Ashura March in London. And there's people holding placards saying down with ISIS. And also in the background, you can't quite read it, but it says Shia Muslims are the biggest victims of terrorism. Of course, this was in, I think, October 2014. So just after the invasion of, or the rise of ISIS in Iraq and the sort of emphasis on ISIS in the media. And so there was very much this sense of we need to distance ourselves from that pejorative perception of Islam. We are not that Islam, we are a different kind of Islam, and we need to be represented as such. So finally, because I know I'm going to run out of time, I want to show you a short clip, which I think encompasses some of these different strands. And just to give you a little bit of background about it, it's actually a form of lamentation poetry that is in a very traditional style, but is recited in English by these three British Pakistani sisters who are Shia. And it's specifically talking about the Battle of Karbala and the death of Imam Hussein, but translating it into a more modern context. And it's called We Are the Shia. So I just want to show you that because I think it encapsulates some of these issues about minority representation and identity that is emerging in the European context. So I'm going to have to change my screens.
We are the Shia of Ali. We are the Shia of Ali. Ya Ali, Ya Ali, Ya Ali, Ya Ali. We know that we will face torture and pain, but that will never stop us from calling your name. We'll hold your flag up high as it touches the sky. Holding tight to the rope of hope we find, with your strength in our side, we will never fall. We are the Shia of Ali. We are the Shia of Ali.
Right, so I think that sort of summarizes some of the themes that I was trying to draw out, especially given that these are three Pakistani sisters who, traditionally within Islam and especially within the communities in which they're from in Pakistan, it would have been very frowned upon for women to publicly sing or publicly have this kind of outward reaching, well, I mean, they're very famous. they're basically YouTube stars. So the fact that they can do this within the context of Britain and within Europe more broadly, and proclaim that, you know, we are the Shia, is this very proud, very specific Muslim identity, I think encapsulates these very different elements. So I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Toshif again.
Thank you very much, Manuel. So now I'll pass it over to Amr to give the last presentation.
Thank you very much, Toshif. I hope you can all hear me well. So yeah, thank you very much. Two fascinating talks. I hope I can provide something interesting as well. So I'm working currently on a book titled, provisionally at least, the Muslim Secular, and I would like to share some of that research with you today. So I'd like to start by saying that, you know, in the field of political thought, in which I work, it is now acknowledged that secularism, which Emmanuel has already spoken about, secularism in the modern world has far more to do with the management of religious diversity than an older European debate about this, you know, the separation between established church and state, which has often dominated this question in the past. So the debate among secularists in India, and chiefly their concern with integrating its large Muslim minority into the national whole, is important for this general shift, both in our modern world and in the academy, because India is one of the earliest and thus most developed intellectual experiments of this neo-political project. A project which in today's India, of course, has been greatly undermined by the advent of right-wing Hindu majoritarian rule, as you will well know. So variants of Indian secularism are bound by the following core principle. India's multiple religions are to be accommodated within the public space, but faith is prevented from defining Indian nationality. So that's the important principle to bear in mind as I go forward with this presentation. But while much has been written about Indian secularism, quite broadly speaking, the voice of its Muslim theorists remains strangely absent from our understanding, from our scholarship. So my current book project attempts to fill that void by returning to the mid-20th century. It uncovers the thought of Muslim thinkers who opposed the separatist Pakistan demand, championed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League. And instead, these thinkers allied with Gandhi and India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, to advocate a single nation shared by Hindus and Muslims prior to independence and partition in 1947. So I'll be referring now to the ideas of three anti-colonial thinker politicians, the Urdu writer and long-serving president of Gandhi and Nehru's Congress Party, Abul Kalam Azad, who's on the left of your screen at the moment. In the middle is the popular Kashmiri nationalist, Sheikh Abdullah. And finally, on the right-hand side is the leading congressman on the Pashtun frontier, which now is on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So my main argument is that these figures didn't simply recycle the ideas of their better-known Hindu friends, Gandhi and Nehru, but produced a distinct Muslim secularity or secularism within the grander intellectual family of secular Indian nationalism. Of course, this was possible because secularism retained religion. So Muslim secularity or the Muslim secular might sound slightly odd, but makes sense once we think of the public space in which religion and, as it were, non-religion can coexist. So to avoid being reduced to a subordinate role from their unique position of Muslim minority, Azad, Abdullah and Khan insisted on imagining the Indian nation in terms of social and cultural parity between Hindu and Muslim. So drawing on diverse themes from medieval history to non-violent ethics and many other themes, they essentially elevated the Muslim constituents, their own Muslim constituents, to positions from which they could be equalized with the Hindu majority. The Muslim was made as crucial to Indian nationality as the Hindu. The idea of parity has often been associated with not socio-cultural arguments as such, but with a long history of constitutional demands made by Muslim separatists to the British Raj. But over the next few minutes, I want to suggest that the ideas I'm exploring had logics of their own, even if they shared a basic anxiety around minorityhood or minoritization with figures like Jinnah. So despite the intellectual agreement between Azad, Abdullah and Khan that I have outlined so far, and I'll get to the detail of what parity really means to them in a moment, they reached this end, they reached this agreement on parity in quite different ways. For how they imagined a Muslim future inside a shared Indian nation was significantly informed by their contrasting regional inheritances. So Azad, Abul Kalam Azad, was associated or had roots or ties to the cities of Delhi and Calcutta, but he didn't really associate himself with city or province identity, but saw himself as somebody who belonged to Hindustan or the plains of northern India. And that will become important as we go along. So Azad believed essentially that Muslims were only a notional minority in India, despite accounting for only 25% of Indians before 1947. Muslims held majorities in 5 of India's 12 provinces and were the largest concentration of Muslims anywhere in the world. Azad claimed that unlike the Hindus, who were riven by divisions of caste and race, India's 95 million Muslims were connected by an egalitarian Islamic brotherhood. From an elite family of Sunni theologians, Azad was effectively issuing a rejection not only of caste hierarchy among Indian Muslims, but also any denominational conflict between them. So with provinces of their own, a substantial population, and apparently the strongest social consciousness in the country, for Azad, Muslims had the requisite strength to hold their own in an Indian democracy. The threat of secular democracy collapsing into Hindu majoritarianism appears so real to Jinnah that the founder of Pakistan had to eventually abandon Indian nationalism and look for a religious alternative. But for Azad, it is precisely because a united democracy poses no such threat, that the Muslims are strong enough, that it possesses no such threat to them, that he can rely on that secular democracy and establish religion outside the domain of national politics. Hinduism and Islam are such formidable social facts that they do not necessitate a national status of their own. That would have no effect, essentially, on their both remaining equally integral to Indian life. But if Hindus and Muslims had maintained their religious autonomies, Azad took his argument for equality or parity further by arguing that these two groups in the realm of profane culture had transcended their separate identities to create an Indian nation on the plains of northern India or Hindustan, ever since the arrival of Islam in the medieval period. Avoiding the language of assimilation and absorption, this profane national culture of India is a separate entity in its own right that is influenced as much by Muslims as by Hindus. Meanwhile, Sheikh Abdullah and Abdul Ghaffar Khan, by anchoring Islam within Kashmiri and Pashtun identities in their overwhelming Muslim regional homelands, found a different way to transcend religious division at the Indian national level. If Abdullah imagined Kashmiri Muslims inheriting a sense of community oriented around local Sufi shrines and mythologies, Khan grounded his non-violent movement for Pashtun and Indian freedom from British rule as much in the tenets of Islam as Pashtunwali, the customary ethical code of the Pashtuns. Effectively territorializing Islam and thereby settling the vexing question of political selfhood for India's Muslim minorities, before we have any discussion about the shared Indianness, Abdullah and Khan, like Azad, also end up clearing this grander national space of religious competition with Hindus. So in a counterintuitive sort of way then, it was by refusing to secularize their Kashmiri and Pashtun sub-nations that Abdullah and Khan were able to champion an inclusive nationalism for all of India. Indeed, rather than posing a threat to secular Indian nationalism, these Muslim sub-nationalisms can be deeply held and yet remain firmly within its ambit because they do not make claims to absolute sovereignty. So just to end then, I should say that while Abdullah, who understood India as an organic collection of equally autonomous regions and lent on traditional blood and soil or old world themes like history and geography to imagine Indian unity, Khan was less interested in describing a shared Indian inheritance from the past, and that was a lot to do with the fact that he was a Pashtun, on the border of India and Afghanistan. So what did he do to imagine an Indian future? He turned instead to the principles of Pashtunwali and fashioned out of it a reciprocal politics of obligation for which one vowed to non-violently uphold the honor of one's friends. This is a basic idea comprehensible to all colonized people, essentially. And Khan, who was certainly Gandhi's most important interlocutor and ally, made this universal reciprocity the foundation of an entirely new national relationship between equals, Muslim Pashtuns on the one hand, and Hindu Indians on the other. And why these two groups? Well, for Khan, they were not only the most committed to establishing an independent India, but their mutual historical distrust of each other, he felt, could be undone by this nonviolent ethics and produce a new politics for a shared future. So with that, I'll hand back to Toshif, and I tried to give you a bit of a tour de force. I hope that it wasn't too much, but we can pick up some of the themes in the discussion.
Toshif, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Thanks, Neil. It was barring me from unmuting for a moment. Thanks very much, Emanuela and Amar, for such rich presentations. And we can already just see, even from these few discussions, that the minority is deployed or refused or harnessed in different ways in different contexts. And so, these rigid understandings already start to sort of fade away. And I think it's been a really, really productive thing to sort of place these different regional and historical contexts into conversation with each other. And so sort of one question I have for the two of you, before we sort of open it up to questions from participants, and do feel free to put your questions into the chat box or raise your hand if you do have something to ask. But how important is place and location and space, or kind of the local, as it were, in the ways that your thinkers or figures or your communities that you look at engage with their own identities or with questions of the minority and the majority? I think, Amar, you mentioned, for instance, how the region sort of comes out in the thinking of these different figures. Emmanuel, you also talked a little bit about this distinct European Shiism, or how Europe kind of plays a role. So how important is place for these different communities? Maybe Emmanuel, you can go first.
Yep, thanks very much. I think place is very significant. I think, as I mentioned partly in the presentation, there is a sense in which specifically the encounter with European secularism has produced specific forms of Muslim minority identity and politics within the European space. And that's something I'm working on as well. I'm also working on a book, but it's currently under review with the publisher. So let's see how that goes. And that's sort of the argument that I make, that there is something about European secularism, and especially the way in which European secularism polices the boundaries of what counts and what constitutes as religious identity, and how that can then be represented in the public sphere, that is very significant for the way in which my participants are engaging with the wider public and trying to create a new version of Shia Islamic identity within that space. I don't know if my participants are always necessarily aware of that. I think, especially with the younger generation who were born and brought up here, it's so embedded in their consciousness and it's so part of who they are that it's not something they really question. But it's only when you compare these communities to ones, say, in the Middle East or in South Asia, that you can see the differences in the way in which they're able to mobilize and the way in which they're able to express themselves. On the flip side of that, I would say that Shiism is, unlike many other religions, I mean, all religions are transnational in some sense, but Shiism is especially transnational because of, as I mentioned, these sort of networks of scholarship and patronage that transcend communities. And actually initially started, or there are some sort of historical debates, and I'm not a historian, so so I'm not going to go into that, but there is a sense in which Shia transnationalism actually began in the Fatimid period in Iran, when they invited scholars over from the Middle East and from elsewhere to try and bolster the Shia profile of the emerging kind of Islamic empire that was happening there. So there is a sense in which sort of Shia transnationalism is very much linked to state building and nation building, and so the flip side of Europe being significant is that this transnational element also comes back. So you have the kind of you have a dynamic, or a sort of a duality happening, where you have the influence of European secularism is being exported transnationally through these links, but then you also have the influence of, say, sectarian geopolitics or specific political ideologies in the Middle East and elsewhere that are then coming back into the European space. So you have this kind of constantly evolving dynamic. I think that sort of summarizes it.
Thank you, yeah. Amr?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I would just, I mean, I've already spoken about the region and the local, as it were. So maybe if we flip it and talk about, the other element of your question, which is the global or the transnational. And I would say that, an argument that the figures I look at often raised was, apart from the sheer strength of Indian Muslims at home, was that they belong to a global Islamic world too. And, this didn't play out in the way that it did for Hindutva or Savarkar, that you talked about Savarkar, who sees this as a threat, the pan-Islamic threat of Muslim unity that will come and destroy Hindu India. But rather what these Muslim inclusivists or secularists thought was that the global Islam should be a source of confidence for Muslims, and that should, that they shouldn't be deterred by a national pact, essentially, with a territorially bound Hindu majority. Muslims were a larger community in some sense. And so this global imagination also played a role in the way they thought about their political position, and it wasn't just a local project, if you like. So I think that's one thing I would say, and the other thing is that the local or the national, in a sense, for Indian Muslim thinkers, is in many ways a template for the rest of the world. So you have the universalist Muslim philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who neither fits really with these Indian nationalist Muslims nor with Muslim separatists of the Pakistan movement. He makes the claim that if you solve the Indian question or the Hindu-Muslim question and you establish minority rights or minority self-determination or federation within an Indian union of some description, and a kind of ethical agreement between Hinduism and Islam to essentially make politics about religious ethics rather than interest and capitalist interest, you would end up providing a template for the rest of the world in which Muslims are also a minority, more generally speaking. So India, in a sense, is the world in miniature for Muslim political thought, because Indian Muslims are a minority there, just as Muslims are a minority at the level of the globe. So yeah, I mean, these demographic equations essentially can be transposed right from local to national to global and make for very interconnected discussions.
Thank you very much. And we see, I mean, just from those brief comments, we see a lot more porosity between the local and the global, or the sort of regional and the transnational, as it were. And likewise in the context that I work in, and I'll just kind of fold in a question that someone has asked on the links between the Kwaja and Borja communities in India and those in Reunion Island. And I don't know much about Reunion Island specifically, but it's a small island in the Indian Ocean. But many of these, the kind of locality of these small island sites and the politics and demographic equations within those small sites, for instance, I work a lot on Zanzibar, reverberate across the Indian Ocean as a site and end up kind of informing politics in a more global way. So, for instance, the campaign for Indian political representation in places like East Africa and South Africa, spearheaded by some of the communities like the Borjas and the Kwajas, end up informing debates in India and debates in the British Empire more broadly. So I guess that's one way to kind of think, just historically about the way that these ideas sort of reverberate. But so I think, I do have a couple more questions to pose to the two of you, but if anyone has any questions for any of us about our specific presentations or about the theme in general, feel free to sort of raise your hand or put a question into the chat box. Well, while you sort of gather your thoughts and think about some questions that you might have, oh, here we go. Hussein, you have a question. That's fantastic. Go ahead. I think you're still
saying
muted.
you need to unmute.
Perhaps he's not able to unmute. I think that was an issue for me as well.
You should be able to.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the technical glitch. Wonderful presentations. Thank you very much, everybody. And a quick one, I just wanted to kind of highlight that when we talk about these minorities, there are internal diversities that we need to acknowledge as well. Like when we say Khoja, we have Khoja Ishnasharis and Khoja Sunnis and Khoja Ismailis, but then Khoja Ismailis would have its own internal diversity, Momnas, Guptis, Shamshis. Amongst us, we have East African Ismailis, non-East African Ismailis, and we talk about these internal diversities as well. And that would be true for any other group, whether we're talking about Shia Ishnasharis, again, there would be internal diversities that we need to acknowledge. The point that I wanted to make is that when these minorities face external factors, they unite. So Khoja becomes one, Ishnashari becomes one. And like in the context of India, where we have 175 million Muslims and almost 30 million Shias, when it is Hindu-Muslim kind of equation, all Muslims come together. But then you see these conflicts in Hyderabad and in Lucknow where, Shias and Sunnis kind of come head on, or for that matter, Khoja Ishnasharis and Khoja Ismailis kind of fighting the battles in the court. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that, when we look at ourselves, like minority groups look at themselves, we, again, I'm using we as because I belong to a minority. We tend to see the kind of fractions, but when we are faced with the enemy, it almost kind of, we get united, and that happens with the Sunni Islam as well. These extremists are not Muslims, but it was interesting to see that Shia Ishnasharis of the UK decided to differentiate themselves from the Sunnis rather than extremists. On the other hand, I know the Ismaili response to this, where it was like, these are not Muslims. These extremists can't be belonging to any faith. And so it would be interesting to hear your views on this whole dynamics.
No, thank you very much, Hussein, for that very perceptive comment. And I think this is something that all three of us are probably thinking about a little bit, is about how these minority groups how they decide, when to kind of claim these more universal categories, and when to kind of perhaps distill out or dilute out, the more discrete minority category. And all I would say is that, this choice that many of these minority communities are faced with, Hussein, you mentioned, this idea of it's only when they're faced with this kind of enemy that they must kind of form together and consolidate into a larger entity. I would say that it's precisely that kind of choice that many of the Indian the thinkers that I look at, and as well as those that Amar works with, are actually trying to think about a politics that doesn't demand that kind of choice, right? So that sort of friend-enemy distinction, right? That the Muslims must unite against a Hindu majority, is one that someone like, Savarkar would accept, right? And he would work with that polarity. And so I would say that, like imagining forms, actual spaces in which that kind of dynamic doesn't need to exist is one way that minorities thought has been actually quite useful and different, and actually departs from the kind of situation that you're describing, right? That's sort of one way. But another way is that this effort to sort of universalize and claim sort of broader global identities, for instance, like a Muslim solidarity, a pan-Islamic solidarity, that might come out of this idea of a kind of threatened subjectivity, often ends up, at least in the context of India, kind of eroding internal differences, right? And rather than offering up forms of solidarity, which is something that one of the impulses behind that kind of formation, it tends to actually maybe recenter or reframe certain ideas about what Islam ought to be and what Islam is, right? Creating this kind of more universal framework ends up actually, even though it's usually offered up by minorities, tends up to sometimes sort of reduce that. But do Amar and Manuel want to say anything about that? I think these are sort of questions that resonate across contexts. Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought I'd just comment something. First of all, thank you very much to Hussein for a very valid point, I think. Of course, as researchers, we know very, very well that the communities that we're studying are not homogenous and they're heterogeneous, but you always have to make some kind of statement or claim. So, and of course, what you point to is the way in which this sort of self-other distinction functions, and the way in which identity is created always with another. Just to speak briefly about my own sort of case, when I think one of the interesting things with looking at the Shia community in Europe is you have this diasporic element, and in the literature on diaspora that's widely recognized, you have this trend away from national, especially in the younger generation. So the longer a diaspora has been in a country of settlement, the more children are born, the more children are raised, and then you have sort of second generation, third generation. We don't have anything beyond that with the Shia communities because they only came in the sort of 70s and 80s. But these different distinctions, so for example, between a South Asian Khoja or an Iraqi tribal community or a Pakistani village, become distilled in the second, third generation when they're all just British, and they were brought up in the same environment. And one of the things I found in my research was that you now have intermarriages between sort of second, third generation Shias from different ethnic and national backgrounds, which would have been unheard of even the generation previously. So, I went to a wedding where there was a Iraqi Alwiya, so a descendant of the Prophet, so, quite high standing, from quite a high socioeconomic background. Her father was a doctor and her mother was a dentist, who married a third generation Pakistani Muslim from a village background in Pakistan. That would have not happened within even a generation ago even in the diaspora. So you have this sort of breaking down of some of the differences. Of course, there are also differences because you have denominational differences, you have differences in terms of what scholar people follow and the different ideational elements. But I think, and also the last point, just to briefly touch upon, because you mentioned that For example, in the European context, you have this differentiation between the Sunni Muslim identity and the Shia Muslim identity, whereas, say, the Ismaili response is to say, well, those are just extremists and they're not Muslim. I think part of the reason for that, I think there's two reasons. One is the sectarianization of politics in the Middle East, and especially the specific targeting of Shia communities by Sunni communities, and the way in which that has become politicized. And the fact that most of the diasporic communities have still family members or have contacts in those countries, it makes it more about the Sunni Shia dynamic rather than about Muslims and extremists, because sectarianism is not just about extremists. You have this sort of very deep-rooted political roots that are part of the structure of the societies in those countries. So, and then the other part of that is also, I think, partly to do with Shiism itself and the history of the Battle of Karbala, specifically, and the politicization of the Battle of Karbala during the Iranian Revolution, in which the sort of victimhood mentality became a political identity. And so if you couple sort of anti-Shia sectarianism with a victimhood mentality, it becomes an almost an anti-Sunni identity rather than a yeah. So that, I mean, I've touched that very briefly and quite sort of crudely, but hopefully you get a sense of, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that was a really good question. I just wanted to kind of, go back a little bit, I suppose, where my research is located, and just say that, why these categories don't get, in a sense, disaggregated in the way that you've suggested. I think is a lot to do with the way, certainly in the Indian context, and was the fact that, colonial knowledge or colonial politics, as representative politics was conceded to Indians in the early 20th century, was conceded on the basis of community and not on the basis of caste or sect and so on, let alone, liberal interest. So, in a sense, figures like Azad or Jinnah had to contend with the fact that they were going to represent Muslims in this kind of very blanket way, and therefore had to make a choice. Do you try and disaggregate this thing, or do you continue with it and try and think about some kind of ecumenical unity? So for both Jinnah and Azad, although they do it very differently, obviously, they're concerned with keeping Muslims united in order to retain their strength in some kind of negotiation with Hindus. So for Azad, it's about retaining that strength within the Congress or within a united India. And for Jinnah, as Faisal Devji's work has shown, it was the Shia who were in the League and in a sense dominating the League in the 30s and 40s that in a sense said, well, we're as fearful of Sunni majoritarianism as we are of Hindu majoritarianism. So let's script Muslim universalism or Muslim nationalism on our terms. And so that kind of history and that kind of forced blanketing, if you like, I'm trying to think of a better term, kind of sets the stage up. And in a sense, we're still inheriting in our politics today some of those legacies. And for me, at least, and I'm sure it's true for our other two speakers today as well, a lot of what inspires me or what forces me to do the work I do is because I think they do talk to the issues that we're facing today.
Thank you very much, Amar, and thank you, Hussein, for that really clearly, stimulating question. We have another one in the chat from Sophia Butt, who is asking, within the Shia minority, are the Kwajas discriminated against more than other Shia minorities given their Hindu lineage? So I can, of course, speak a bit to that, but maybe, Emmanuel, you can also speak to that in the UK context, perhaps. So, I mean, I would say that the Kwajas certainly try to almost immediately after the events of the kind of 19th century, where the colonial state tries very much to define them in the courtroom, they are very avid about rejecting or disavowing their sort of Hindu past, and they see it very much as a past. So various efforts are made within the community to either sort of change surnames. So certain surnames like Ramji, for instance, are which are seen to reference a Hindu past, are changed to more Islamic identifiers. Various traditions that might reference this Hindu past are also purged out. And this goes in line with what Amar was sort of talking about, this sort of scripting of a blanket Islamic identity for all sorts of reasons. But what ends up happening is that partly because the Khojas cannot really reference this sort of pan-Islamic identity in their past, they have to purge a sort of Hindu element and sort of recover Islamic histories, whether that's in the Fatimid period or elsewhere, to kind of make up for this disavowal. So there is that sort of rejection from within the community of a Hindu past, for sure. As far as how the broader Shia minority discriminates against the Kwaja community, I'm not entirely sure. I know that in many instances, the Khojas are seen as, there's a sort of Orientalist who used to call them Hindus under a light Muslim veneer, and I'm sure that sentiment is probably shared by certain Shia communities. But maybe Emmanuel can speak a little bit more about how the broader Shia community sees the Khojas.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Actually, in the UK context, it's not something I've come across at all. And I think part of the reason for that is socioeconomics. So the Khoja community in the UK tend to have quite high socioeconomic status, especially compared to the large numbers of South Asian Shia who tend to be from slightly lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And so the Khojas are more comparable to, say, the Iranian or the Arab communities, in that they tend to be from quite middle class, relatively affluent backgrounds. For that reason, they're actually quite dominant in the Shia community in the UK. I would say between the Iraqis and the Khojas, they have all the institutional dominance, they have the financial dominance, and so there isn't really a sense, certainly for that I've seen from I'm sure there are some sort of theological disputes, and I'm sure there are some Shias who would say discriminate. But then also, if you're talking about in the UK context where you have these large numbers of Arab and Iranian Shia, Iranian Shia all converted from Zoroastrianism, Arab Shias all converted from Sunni Islam. So I don't think it's very difficult for them. It would be very difficult for them to discriminate against the Khoja for having a Hindu background when they themselves do not have a Shia background. So I don't think that really comes up at all, or certainly not that I've seen, especially in the younger generation. It's much more that the Khojas are actually quite well represented, quite dominant. A lot of the campaigns, for example, that I referenced are run and funded by Khojas. They have one of the largest Shia mosques, two of the largest Shia mosques in London, and then after that would be the Iraqis, and then the Iranians, and then the Lebanese. So, and there are some also South Asians, but again, those are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's a very different environment, I think, in the UK and Europe.
Thank you, Emmanuel. No, that's really, really fascinating to see how the differences between the kind of historical examples and the contemporary situation in the UK and Europe. Do we have any more questions from the audience for our presenters? Great. You're welcome, Sophia. That was a great question. Thank you. Well, if we don't, I do have one sort of very, very general question for the two of you about the kind of broader, and Amr, you've already actually, you both sort of gestured at this, but I mean, to what end can we kind of expand some of this discussion beyond the sort of Muslim minority or internal Muslim minority to what other minorities in totally different contexts are facing? Do we see some sort of parallel between our own work and global minorities elsewhere? As we know, we're living in an era of increased kind of majoritarianism, an increased turn towards minority repression. So, I mean, how can we kind of think through the Muslim minority as a way to to think about these broader questions. And I'm not sure, I mean, you can choose to answer this in however you want to.
Sure. Shall I go? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are 2 points that I'd like to really make on this, and one is just continuing on from where I left off in the last discussion that we had with Hussein, which is that basically, you know, I think what we should, when we think about Indian Muslim anxiety around minoritization, I think it's just an example of the kind of structural problems associated with modern democracy. And it's not something that, you know, we need to think about as existential or inherent to being Muslim or to Islam. And so in the Indian context, you see the question of minoritization or the fear of being a minority, you know, resonating with countless groups across the country as the, you know, moment of decolonization is coming. So you see this with Punjabi Hindus or Sikhs in Punjab, or Kashmiri Brahmins, and, you know, so in a sense, this is kind of transferable, it's reversible, this whole equation. So I think that's important to think about. So when we think about Muslim minorityhood, it's not just, of course, you know, Islam does play a role in the way people think about their position in a polity, but it doesn't necessarily name minoritization on its own. Or you know, it's not the fundamental factor when we think about what it means to be a minority per se. And you see this play out, for example, with in various contexts. So obviously with European Jews is the archetypical example in modern history. But of course, you know, there's some very interesting recent work, you know, by a friend of ours at Oxford, Hannah Tika, who's working on Chinese Muslim military leaders in this similar period that I work in, you know, in the Republican period in China. And, you know, their Chinese Muslim elites are also concerned with becoming a minority, but they're also perceptibly aware of, you know, other minorities, ethnic minorities in their own country, whether it's Tibetans and so on. So that's one thing I would like to say, is the point of the structural element in this whole question about minority. And the other is to say that, you know, in the case of my figures, and if we think about today, you know, secularism wasn't the dominant, Indian secularism, and certainly not Muslim secularism, certainly wasn't the dominant ideology of that period. And it wasn't certain to emerge victorious, you know, after independence. And it had to compete not just with Jinnah's Muslim nationalism and Pakistan movement, but also with fascistic Hindu nationalism that you, Toshik, have referred to with Savarkar, but also anti-political Islamist visions, you know, of theocracy, where there is no space really for political creativity and sovereignty is given up to God. So it's famously articulated in South Asia by the Islamist thinker Maududi. So therefore, you know, figures like Azad, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Abdullah, are, you know, part of a multifaceted intellectual context in which their, you know, vision of an inclusive India and rights for Muslims, you know, was only one of many possibilities. And so when we think about the fact that they were competing often with very illiberal ideologies, you know, Islamism or Hindu fascism, then they speak, their ideas speak very meaningfully to a host of, you know, international challenges faced today by liberals or inclusivists, not just in India, obviously.
Thank you, Amar. Manuel?
Yeah, I think, so I'm going to take this question slightly differently. And I would say that in my work, I use the case of Twelver Shias in Europe more to highlight the way in which minority politics is being produced globally. So it's a sort of reflection of our contemporary times in the way in which identities that didn't used to exist are coming into being and becoming politicized. And that you can see that across the board. So, for example, when some of my research participants actively model themselves on, say, the Black Lives Matter movement or the Occupy protests. I mean, you have this rise of the Shia rights movement, and there's sort of hashtags and all sorts of things that go along with that. And I think part of that is also the way in which woke politics has become such a buzzword of the last maybe 10 years. And I wanted to give a sort of quick anecdotal example of this. So one of my participants who I've been studying is a blogger who's actually based in the States, but she's of Iranian background, and she is practicing Shia Muslim. She wears the hijab. And she wrote a blog post about her experience of celebrating or commemorating Muharram during a Black Lives Matter protest. This was in last year, so last summer 2020, which was obviously, there was a lot going on with the Black Lives Matter protests in the States. And she used the phrase, if every land is Karbala, then this land, so the phrase, sorry, I should contextualize this, the phrase every land is Karbala and every day is Ashura, which is a reference to the death of Imam Hussein and the killing of Imam Hussein, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, was politicized, was actually coined by an Iranian thinker, Ali Shariati, in the mid-20th century, and then was politicized by Ayatollah Khomeini during the Iranian Revolution as a phrase to essentially promote the revolutionary potential of Shiism. And so this blogger used this phrase saying, if every land is Karbala, then this land, referring to the United States, where there was a European settlement and colonial settlement that caused the genocide of the indigenous population, plus the mass enslavement of Black people, then this land is Karbala. And then she said, if every day is Ashura, then the day in which black men are being killed in the streets by US police for no other reason except the color of their skin, then this day is Ashura. So I thought this was a really interesting marriage of this sort of this contemporary woke politics and the politicization of minority identity, but used within a kind of Shia framework. So I would say that, to answer your question more specifically, Telshiv, that there are connections everywhere, that this is not specific to a particular community, it's not specific to a particular religion, it's not specific to a particular ethnicity. I think this is just the way in which global politics is currently functioning, and it's also reflective of, well, I mean, I could go into it, but sort of capitalism and the segmentation of the market and the way in which you can now brand things for specific ethnicities or religions or whatever, and you create more revenue for yourselves. And I think that there's a lot of work now on the kind of woke washing of publicity campaigns and big American corporations who are using sort of woke politics, and also the pink washing, for example. So I mean, I'm going on a tangent, but I think you can see that these strands go through all of these different communities, elements, whatever, and it's more about how politics functions and how power functions and what it means to be a minority today, whatever that minority is.
Well, I think that's actually a fantastic point to end on. I think, and what I, just to kind of sum up the two, what the three of us have been kind of gesturing at is that, and to kind of rehearse something that comes out of Indian history, is that the minority is actually a very interesting category to think with, and to think through, and actually that the European or American world historical minorities are not the only actors on the stage, as it were, and its connections are indeed everywhere. And so I hope all of the participants here have found this useful and helpful, and we have some really supportive comments in the chat, and I do hope we will be here again next year. If there are any last comments that either of the presenters want to make before I close the meeting? Nope. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and have a lovely week, and thank you all for attending.